we've seen a radical shift in American sentiment over police reform, again, that I don't think many of us were expecting, even some of the people who are out there protesting. And just today, I was looking at a few of the polls that have come out. Americans are now near unanimous in saying that they feel change is needed, change to policing is needed, with well over half saying that major change is needed. Only 1% of Democrats and 14% of Republicans think that things are fine the way that they are. So that's pretty incredible. And I was also looking at a morning consult poll, which was a poll of over 250 police officers who are also registered voters. And even a majority of police now say that they support the Black Lives Matter movement. Almost half of white police officers as well. And they were asked about 10 out of 10 reforms that are common, reforms that are being called for. And a majority, and often a very comfortable majority, all agreed that with those reforms. So we're talking things like, preventing military gear from going to local police departments, 5 or 6 reforms that would add accountability, banning chokeholds, things that seem controversial if you're on Twitter, but if you ask, I guess, Americans and police officers aren't as controversial as we might think. So I think that that's really been incredible. So what was most striking to me is the near unanimous support for changing management practices so that officers with numerous instances of abuse of power are no longer allowed to serve on the force. So 95% of Republicans, 99% of Democrats, and 98% of independents all supported removing, adding accountability measures, and also removing police officers with repeated instances of misconduct from the force and not allowing them to serve again. And so the reason why that's so striking is because the call for this type of accountability has been at the heart of the mass protests that have been springing up around the country with devastating regularity since the police killings of Eric Garner and Michael Brown in 2014. That is the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor triggered these most recent protests. The Black Lives Matter movement is now, some experts are saying, the largest movement in American history. So we have this unanimous, near unanimous support for the sort of, I mean, there's definitely a lot of other reforms that the protesters are calling for, but the very crux, the very trigger, punish officers who kill people while they're on duty. Every American, it seems, supports that. So, yeah, I mean, I just feel like that's been very striking to me, because then you sit back and you kind of ask, like, well, then why are we going through all of this right now? Why not just do what has been asked for so many years, particularly with such overwhelming support. But I think that we're at a place now where more and more municipalities are saying yes to reforms that had previously been met with a lot of resistance. There's some municipalities that are talking about reimagining their police department completely or reducing funds. I think there's police departments that are going to be forced to reduce funds because of the economic constraints. So we, are at this, I think, really important point in history. And the biggest question that I think is on everybody's mind is, how can we keep our communities safe, which I think everybody wants, and certainly as a journalist I've found that people in all communities want safe policing that keeps them safe. But at the same time, how can we do this while respecting people's constitutional rights and really having the whatever type of law enforcement we have be a force that brings prosperity to a community, and safety is a form of prosperity, and not pain and unnecessary downfall. So I think those are the big questions, and there's more that we'll delve into, but we have 3 excellent speakers who all have very deep experiences with these issues. all from different vantage points. Our first speaker, Jason Williams, is an activist scholar and an assistant professor of justice studies at Montclair State University. And over the last decade, he's published numerous works on racial disparities and mistreatment within the criminal justice system. Most recently, he co-edited and contributed to a collection of essays titled Black Males in the Criminal Justice System, which just came out this year and is available online. Jason also was raised by his grandmother in a public housing complex in New Jersey, and his personal experience, I think, is very important in this context, but his personal experience with policing, with the other social constraints that come with living in public housing is what motivated him to pursue his doctorate in criminology. Sorry, Jason is actually currently working with our second speaker, EVELYN GARCIA, on research that examines the experiences of Black and Latina mothers who have been through the truancy system, which is a system that enforces penalties, including criminal penalties, for children missing school. So that research isn't published yet, but you guys are gonna get a sneak peek. We're gonna talk about it a little bit, so very exciting. So EVELYN is a lecturer at Fairleigh Dickinson University, and she also has extensive experience, over 35 years of experience in policing. She started her career at the NYPD. She spent 20 years at the NYPD from 1984 to 2004, which was during this time of transition that impacted the way that the whole nation does policing. So we'll talk a little bit about that. She was first a patrol officer in Harlem, and Spanish Harlem, and a commanding officer at the police academy. She's done ethics trainings for the U.S. Department of Justice's International Law Enforcement Training Center in Botswana. Her work as a researcher has focused on ethics and policing, and she most recently published and co-edited a collection of essays called Contemporary Ethical Issues in the Criminal Justice System. So a lot of people had questions about training and ethics, and she will be our point person expert on those issues. And then our third speaker, Andrew Cohen, is a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice and a senior editor at the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit journalism outlet that's dedicated to covering criminal justice. In Andrew's 3-decade career covering law and justice, he's made a name for himself as one of the nation's leading legal analysts, and his commentary has been honored with 2 Silver Gavel Awards. Prior to joining Marshall Project, he was a senior legal analyst at 60 Minutes and at CBS Radio. So he is very knowledgeable about some of the very nuanced legal topics that he'll talk about, including qualified immunity, and has a very good kind of bird's eye view of this shift in sentiment that's been taking place. Turning back to Jason. I just want to plug his most recent published essay. If you haven't read it already, I highly, highly recommend his essay, Black Males and Their Experiences with Policing Under the Iconic Ghetto in Ferguson, Missouri. And that's part of the collection that he published this year. I hope you'll tweet it if you haven't already after the show, so people can go to your account, follow you, and read it. So I found the piece really fascinating because it's centered on ethnographic research that Jason did in Ferguson, Missouri, right after the protest over the police killing of Michael Brown, which is what I think brought the Black Lives Matter movement to national prominence for a lot of people. It's kind of what started this whole movement that we're seeing today. And his piece very holistically addresses many of the issues that are just now getting serious consideration in the context of police reform. He actually starts off by kind of describing what sounds like a kind of gaslighting of the Black community. I think, talking about how a lot of people didn't believe that this type of violence and brutality and targeted policing and so forth was occurring. And now, as I've just said, a lot of people do believe it. But another issue is this concept of the iconic ghetto, which Jason will explain in more detail. But it essentially looks at the entirety of the experience of Black Americans who live in low-income neighborhoods, and the entirety of experience that prevents them from escaping or that follows them if they do. And the reason why I think that that's so fascinating, when I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, because the defund abolition movement is now, it seeks to address that entirety of experience rather than what had, been happening of kind of narrowly focusing on certain police reforms. The defund abolition movement talks about the school, like tackles the school to prison pipeline all in one thing. So it seems like a new concept to a lot of people. As a reporter, I think it's something that I've been hearing, from communities of color for years, but now it's kind of formalized into calls to action. So yeah, he's going to talk about these concepts, both from his personal experience and his years of research, and what the reforms would look like if implemented.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. And also thanks to Rhoda and the Network for Responsible Public Policy for holding this event. So I'm very thankful to be here tonight and to be engaging with everyone, and thanks to the audience as well. So first, I'd like to simply state that we are truly experiencing, as I mentioned at some of the other events that I spoke at lately, an epistemic nightmare in American policing, right? And particularly at this moment, the murdering of Black bodies at the hands of the state has reached a huge level, a major level of discontent that has caused a historical level of condemnation, right? Not only from Black folk, but from people of all stripes, all ages, all economic levels, and so forth. And likewise, for the first time in a very long time, it has caused us to sort of put policing under the spotlight. And this is a very, very good thing. So moving into the Ferguson piece, in which I use Elijah Anderson's The Iconic Ghetto, because I know, Sarah, you just mentioned this. His concept, The Iconic Ghetto, came out of his 2011 book, The Cosmopolitan Canopy, Race and Civility in Everyday Life, and in which he accentuates essentially that the modern day color question is now affixed to inscriptions of geography, and that for Black folks in particular, this means being inextricably tied to the ghetto, right? Even if one isn't from the ghetto. Right? Even if you did not come up in the ghetto and you perhaps have come up in suburbia, the notion here is that when non-Blacks look at you, they see the ghetto. They see a walking representation of the American ghetto, essentially the undercarriage. And he further laments that, this includes even those who may ascend to high levels of success. So for instance, President Obama, right? And I'm sure we all can recall some of the depictions of President Obama, and perhaps even in the immediate aftermath of him winning the presidency, but then also throughout his duration of being in the White House. So in this context, even an accomplished doctor, right, can be still associated with the ghetto, right? So ascending to higher levels of success means nothing, which in turn also makes you more viable for dehumanization, right? The ghetto equaling one being susceptible to higher levels of dehumanization and everything else that is appertaining to those who have been rendered to the undercarriage. And in this view then, Blacks are then marked based on geographic connotation. So the ghetto then becomes proxy for race. And remember, this is within the backdrop of we now being a post-racialized society, right? So now the geographic location becomes proxy for race. Trayvon Martin, and although this is in the context of vigilante justice, but Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and the victims of state violence and vigilante justice, for instance, are now murdered for perhaps being in the wrong place at the wrong time, if you will, or whatnot. And therefore the violence and the erasure even of gentrification, because I know this might even come up, right? And the specific kind of policing that occurs even within these zones are okay, because ghettos, they don't seem to possess anything or anyone worth saving, right? Anyone or anything worth saving. So with my Ferguson sample in particular, yes, the narratives I collected corroborated much of what Anderson accentuates within this theory in particular. And he uses some of his own autoethnographic accounts, but alongside some of the data that he collected to substantiate the thesis. But also within this chapter, I should state that I also utilize Cruz's theory of internal colonialism, right? In which he basically states that the ghetto is a sustained system of racialized control and domination that keeps Black in this sort of caste-like state. So when you consider policing in this light, you're creating this sort of, you know, what we have essentially is a recipe of utter and sustained disaster. Utter and sustained disaster. So moving to the second point, Sarah, as far as like divestment, abolition, and so forth and so on, when you consider the totality of circumstances here regarding the levels of social controls that Blacks are subjected to, abolition or divestment, whatever term you want to use, it becomes the only way forward. Becomes the only way forward. For instance, new ways of policing, they don't seem to work. So whenever these incidents seem to occur, whether it be Mike Brown, right, Breonna Taylor, so forth and so on, we hear about community policing, we hear about hotspot policing. But what these new ways of policing do is they sort of create new ways in which to better police agencies. They're not doing anything to help the actual communities, right? What are we doing to help the community members? That should be at the top of our agenda. Are we addressing the legacy of racism or economic depravity, right? Which is sort of inherent in Cruz's thesis around internal colonialism, right? Policing cannot undo these injustices. We cannot train police to address those types of issues. In fact, police are not trained to do those types of things. We train police officers actually to police our inner cities like warriors, right? And so what abolition forces us to do is to think about ways in which we can empower the community to sort of democratize our ways of looking at social control and sort of the system and the tension that occurs within some of these communities. Again, I would argue that these communities need mental health and social service resources, and sort of the creation of a path towards true inclusion and democracy. You know, community-based plans and outcomes for these types of communities that have shown to work. And I hate to use this term evidence-based, because what does that even mean, right? I believe that's socially and politically constructed in many ways. But we do know that credible messengers, the violence interrupters, different initiatives such as these, the Boys and Girls Club, right, other kinds of recreational programs such as those have shown to work. And what we would argue is that funds that go into police departments ought to be revamped and redirected into programs such as these, so that you give communities voice, right, and power to govern themselves, sort of get rid of the paternalistic framework, right, within which we as Blacks have always had to live. And from a personal note, as I was mentioning earlier, I can remember growing up in a housing project and having a neighborhood watch who patrolled, and we called them the bumblebees because their uniform consisted of like black and yellow coloring, if you will. So they look like bumblebees and whatnot. But these were adults, and they took their position very seriously. And they did so because they loved their community and they knew their community, which is something that isn't always the case with policing. And this was something that I also found in my own research in Ferguson and Baltimore, right? Many of the participants did not feel as if the police officers were truly part of their community, or at least based on their interactions with the police officers, they didn't feel that, right? But also if you look at the official records, right, many of the officers are not from there or what have you. But anywho, going back to this community patrol, when they would come across incidents, they handled them with care. And particularly when we're talking about incidents with kids, right? And so what you didn't have was this sort of jump starting of these sort of school to prison pipeline type of deal here, right? With kids coming in contact with a authority figure and being immediately thrown into the system. You didn't have that. Now, if there were larger incidents, of course, they would have to call the cops in, and then that would matriculate through the official, process here, what have you. But this was a system that worked until, of course, they had to disband it due to lack of funding and commitment. like everything else in the late 90s going into the early 2000s. But again, we know that these types of initiatives work, right? And they empower the communities. They give community members jobs, they give them skill sets, and they give them a sense of sustenance, right? And when we're talking about a community that has long been denied the right to have say in how it is governed, this might be the way forward towards true democratic inclusion. Because one thing I will say is, I would say the problem as a nation is that we have not allowed the Black community to have say in how it is to be governed. And that's truly the ultimate conundrum of our time, as we claim to be this pluralistic, fully inclusive democratic society. So we have to think about how democracy intersects with policing, and how we can go about making democracy more accessible for the Black community.
Great, thank you so much. Before we get away from that, I just wanted to follow up really quick, Jason, with the importance of the community taking leadership in addressing its own issues and what that essentially means to community, to see its own community members taking leadership rather than having kind of policing kind of imposed on them. Can you just add a point or two about that before we move on?
Yes, yeah. Well, because what happens is, like, particularly with community policing, which if you go around and you interview some folks within urban communities about policing, in particular community policing, right? Many will tell you it felt like an occupation, right? Like an occupational force coming in and sort of imposing its will onto the community. And again, this goes at, I think, the crux, the heart of what it means to be in a democratic society, right? A society in which everyone is supposed to have voice, everyone is supposed to matter, except, of course, if you are Black and you exist within subjective citizenship. And when you think about, in particular, and I can speak to the housing project in particular, right? Because as I mentioned, this is the petri dish, right? This is where I think the government really sort of trial and error everything, because when you think about Clinton back in the 90s with the Get Tough on Crime bills and everything that came out of there with the one striking you're out policies in public housing authority complexes. And I'm thinking about how many people, there were scores of people who were evicted for very minor and petty offenses, right? And we didn't have say in the construction of those policies. And so many people were put outside, became homeless as a result of this. Or for instance, let's say you're a family, and you had someone who was incarcerated, they're about to come home, they lived with you their whole life, they're coming home, they need a place to stay, and you have to tell this person, well, can't come here because according to the new rules, if you come here, we're all going to be kicked out.
I think that's very important, and again goes back to giving people agency to address the problems in their community and in their families, because in a white communities, completely honest, there are people that get incarcerated, and the parents would have the choice about how they want to handle that issue with their child. The choice being, and it's a hard choice. I have personal, experience with it, but a tough choice. Do you do tough love? Do you try and support the child, help the child get back on their feet? It's a really tough choice, but in white communities, parents do have the choice. And I think that what you're talking about is how the choice of how to handle this very difficult situation is kind of made for people in housing projects, and a lot of parents wouldn't want to kick their kids out on the street.
No, but they were forced as a result of policy, right? By policy and law to do so. And frankly, this is qualitatively the same as what was done on plantations, where Black families were broken up, right? And told that you can't go here, you can't go there. And yet, again, this adds to recidivism. It adds to the cyclical nature of mass incarceration of Black folk in particular, but also Latinx individuals.
Yep.
So it did nothing. The policy was nonsensical, and the only thing it did was annihilate the agency of already marginalized individuals that were living in these spaces. So again, housing project complexes are the petri dishes, I would say, right? Where they trial and error a lot of these policies. And in the 90s, again, through mechanisms such as community policing, right? All of these kinds of egregious policing practices were trial and errored in these spaces. And we continue to see the progeny of this, the egregiousness, the product of this. And New York City in particular, and a lot of the housing projects over there, which I know you are aware of, Sarah.
Yes, yes, I am. Thank you very much. I have so many follow-up questions that we'll get to at the end. But first, moving on to EVELYN, we did get a lot of questions before the program started on issues of ethics and trainings and different types of reforms that are on the table. And EVELYN is going to speak to us about that, and then also tracing some of the history of why we see racism on the force, which I want to note, by the way, according to that police survey, a majority of police acknowledge that police, treat white people better than Black people. So it's a widely acknowledged issue. But anyway, I'll stop talking now and turn it over to EVELYN.
No, and that's pretty interesting. Thank you, Sarah. And I also like to thank Rhoda from the Network for Responsible Public Policy for having me here this evening. And good evening to all in the audience. I'm delighted to be here this evening to share both my policing experience and research with you. And I just wanted to underscore these very unfortunate and highly controversial incidents that Jason has described and what the country has witnessed in the media have given way to speculation on the propriety of current use of force practices that are in place for police. There are many questions that need to be answered, particularly whether these practices are outdated and in need of reform. And also, another area that I'd like to focus on is community policing, right? And community and police relations. And so in order to contextualize democratic policing for those of you in the audience that when you think about how do we reform police, I just want to describe what we're actually talking about. Understand that here in the United States, well, according to 2018 statistics, there were approximately 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. And that includes sheriff, county sheriff's office, city and state police departments, and federal law enforcement agencies. And of this number, 13 are at the municipal level. And I highlight this fact is because when we talk about police reform, understand that it's not, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on where this police department and at what level is going to dictate what you can do, okay? And I will say that although their jurisdictions and their areas of specialization vary, their fundamental duties are strikingly similar, and that is to protect and serve. And so they're charged with balancing the obligation to crime control while at the same time they have to preserve individual civil liberties that are outlined in the Bill of Rights. And when there's a disregard for these procedural protections, that's where we see the police and the community, their relationships become uneasy. And so, which leads me to the first of two themes that I'd like to briefly touch upon this evening, that being the importance of community police relations. And I realize that Jason did touch upon, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, but just to put it in just really basic terms, community policing, the quality of any kind of relationship can be measured by whether the involved parties, they share this mutual respect for each other, right? And the lack of either can lead to strained relations. So this logic can be applied to the case of community policing, community police relations in the United States. If there's a lack of respect or mutual trust, relations are going to be strained. And in modern day policing, there exists this potential for these strained relations to result in civil unrest, as we see unfolding, and other rather extremely unfortunate incidences, and mainly deaths. And so the second theme that I'd like to just talk about, to put it in context, is that when we have to think about, in the context of policing activities, we have the use of force, right? And police use of force refers to the amount of effort required by the police to compel compliance by an unwilling subject, right? And most of the police departments across the country has adopted a police use of force continuum. And the reason that I'm putting these two pieces together, community police relations, understand that police use of force, these continuums that guide how do police officers respond in particular situations, right? And they describe that the actions that they have to take, and it gives guidance on the amount of force that police officers should use when they're involved in these encounters. And these encounters can range from something quite simple as to, or involve the use, something that requires the use of force. So to determine whether use of force is considered to be excessive, police departments rely on this use of force continuum. And putting these two pieces together, it just really highlighting some of the workings of police departments. We're dealing with how do we deal with community and police? How do we ensure that when we come in contact with the police, that it doesn't result in some of these situations that we see? And to put it in context, according to BJS statistics, they do take account of police-public interactions, police-public contacts. And those police-public contacts, they total in, over the hundreds of thousands. I believe it's close to 1 million contacts on an annual basis. And so, well, actually on a less than annual basis. I have to check those statistics. But there's quite a bit of police and public contact. And when you really take a look at the outcomes of these contacts, many of them are, they don't result in arrest. They don't result in deaths when we compare that to this police use of force continuum, the actions. And so it's just a really relatively small number of individuals that come in contact with the police that actually have these deadly use of force being placed upon them, right? Or they're met with deadly force. And so when you take a look at the statistics, what you'll actually see, and a lot of times it surprises a lot of people, and I would throw this question out to my students, is if you just imagine, or what do you think, who gets shot by the police or who gets killed by the police more often when you take a look at the breakdown by race? And so many of the students will say African Americans. And when you really take a look at the numbers, you do have whites are killed by the police more often, or deadly physical force is used on white males at higher rates than any of the other races. And so,
sorry, rates and not total number.
Yeah, the race, right. So when you do a comparison, when you compare whites versus Latinx versus African American males, you'll find that there are a higher percentage of white males are met with deadly physical force. And so that would make sense, because you would think that, okay, so there are more white males in the population, so they get shot at higher rates. But if you really take a look at the numbers, if you dig deep, what you'll find, and if you use this, take a look at the use of force continuum, what you'll find is that, yes, white males do get are met with deadly physical force at higher rates than any of the other groups. However, using this use of force continuum, you'll see that in the cases of white males, they are armed. They're using the same amount of force. The police are applying the same amount of force that's being used against them, because generally speaking, the police use of force continuum, officers are they're expected to use the amount of force that's commensurate with the amount of force that's being used against them. So in basic terms, if you're being met with the level of resistance is that you're using a firearm, then it's if the officer uses a firearm as well, then it's an application of use of force. Is it excessive? No, it's not. And bring that to with African American males, although they have a smaller percentage of instances of being shot by the police. When you take a look at these use of force continuum, in many instances, these males are unarmed. So that's where you beg the question, right? And so that's where, if you know how to really take a look at, dig deep, you know, the percentages, they say, okay, this makes sense. But if you really take a look at, you know, the finer details, and in this case, namely, what is the level of resistance that African-American males are using against the police that warrants this deadly physical force? It's just not there. So that's where you have, that's where the questions begin. Why is it that, although they are a smaller percentage, but in those terms, looking at the police use of force continuum, that's an application of excessive force in the highest level, right? And so that's where some of these questions come in, and in the use of force. And so using use of force continuums and developing, there are some researchers that develop a use of force continuum, a force factor level, and they just basically outline how police managers can incorporate or use these force factor levels to determine whether or not the application of use of force is considered to be excessive. And it's just basically quantifying, because use of force continuums, they have about 6 levels, and it varies. And so you're looking at officer resistance versus, or not officer resistance, you're looking at the resistance that is being directed at the police, and then looking at the type of force that's being used. And it's a numbers game, they quantify it, and if you do they create a formula, if the level of force being applied is greater than the level of resistance that's being presented, then that's considered to be excessive use of force. And not all departments use that, but it would be a good way to try to really take a look at these applications of use of forces. And there are other levels that are involved. And I think that in looking at these use and documenting these use of forces, there are other levels that I believe, you know, and I understand why looking at excessive use of force, and especially deadly physical force, is so important. But I'm of the mindset that if you look at these other levels, then those are indications that, you know what, you may have a problem. And when I say take a look at the lower levels, in some instances, you know, some of the other levels of force are, you know, applying, you know, verbal, right? And so, or using less than lethal weapons. And so I think that particularly in the case of verbal, a use of force, which people don't really think about, but I came across some research that, you know, really took a look at the experience of African-American males and their perceptions of the police. And a lot of them reported that, you know, they felt as though the way that the police spoke to them was disrespectful, right? So, you know, taking into account that's a level of disrespect, or using force, verbal force, that is inappropriate. And just thinking about, if you're documenting these sorts of things, and I know that there's always problems with documenting, you know, you have to rely on the fact that you know, the officers will actually report them or prepare these reports. If you have several that you see that, you know what, you have a particular individual that is subjecting some of the community members to these microaggressions, or calling them names, it's a level of disrespect. It hasn't been it hasn't gotten to the level of where it's really disconcerting. But I think that it really does, if you, it's building upon, or if you're on the pathway to these strained relations. And so the use of force, you know, the documentation can be very useful. And so I combine this use of force and there's and combining how it has an impact on community police relations, that is so important. And so, you know, in terms of developing, you know, when we see these use of forces, then, you know, we see the visual, and as a result of like the visuals, we see the unrest. And so when we think about developing police reforms, we have to understand the root causes, because we're here today to talk about police reforms and what does police reform look like. I think that in order to understand or to change policing, as Jason so eloquently stated, is that you really have to take a look at the root causes and understand that many of these issues that we see, or with policing, we have to understand that when we see the police and the community members interact, that's really just a result of they're being in contact in times of distress or some of these social ills. There's underlying problems that need to be addressed, and that causes individuals to engage in or commit crimes or to be a nuisance. And an example would be, we have to understand that the discourse that we're seeing is that we have to understand the policing as a tool of social control, because that's really what it is. And that just really leads into this whole notion of, we have to think about what the role of policing is, the policing function. We have seen in the last 40 years that the role of police has expanded. Many police departments are required, or police officers are required to do things that normally they're not in a position to. They're asked to address social ills. And so there's a lot of ways that we have to think about reform. More often than not, when we think about policing, we think about training, we think about education, we think about diversity, we think about implicit bias training. And all of those things are, if you really take a look at and really try to develop these models that have a likelihood that they'll actually work, that's fine. But what we also need is to take a look at some of the other social ills that exist, because those are some of the root causes that, by and large, we're really not aware of. And I say things like, gentrification, as Jason mentioned, gentrification, the police officer, their expanded role, they're not really, I don't know if they're really aware of, but they're used as social control. They're there to keep the peace in these areas that are being gentrified. And so you're putting them in a position where some of these outcomes might not fare well. I'll say farewell, because, yeah. And so, one of the things, in closing remarks, there's a lot, and I'm sure there could be a lot of questions that we can address, and I think that a lot of the conversations interlock. But one of the things that I want to say also is that a lot of times we think about, how to improve these community police relations, and a lot of times we think about, the community. We also have to keep in mind part of this community and police relationship is looking at the police themselves, because they are human. And as you mentioned, with these public opinion surveys, now when they're questioning police inside of the police department, they agree with all of these, with these policies. They believe in the Black Lives Matter, because they're in the forefront, they're on the front lines, and sometimes many of them are in a position where they might think, if I wasn't here in uniform, I would be on the other side with the people that are protesting. And so, and understand that police, a lot of, in terms of their training, they're asked to go and protect and serve in crime control, and many of them have the intention to do just that, control crime in the best way that they know how. So you can't fault them. And also understanding that police as well, they're humans, they have concerns, they have feelings, they have challenges as well that they're dealing with, and they have challenges as well even inside of the police departments, because trust me, there is structural racism within the police department as well. And at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that, and when we want to try to figure out a way to reform policing or build, better communities, we have to also, we have to think about the well-being of all involved. And so, because these are stressful times, and we have to think about the community's well-being, and also the police that are there to protect and serve us as well, because there are people that are fighting from the inside, right? And it's not limited to one particular race. We're all human, and I think that in this discussion of how do we reform, you know, we think about the well-being of all parties involved. You have a lot of, in the past year, there was very high suicide rate amongst police officers, and in that given all of that they're dealing with, I think we have to think about, you know, give some thought to that as well. Mental health, well-being for all parties involved, and that's a starting point to build these stronger communities and give back and take control over, you know, our own communities. And just to Jason's point, because I just wanted to mention, I as well, I'm so passionate. My path to this seat where I'm at right now, it has been, you know, this is my journey. But I also as well, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in the housing project, Cypress Hills. And yes, I remember, you know, there was a time that the community police themselves, we had a version of we called it tenant patrol. And that just consisted of, you know, people in the building that, you know, they had a schedule, and, you know, from the hours of 7 to 11, maybe 7 to 10, but they'd have the folding chairs, and sometimes they're playing cards, but they're monitoring and they're making sure that everything is okay. And so they took care of, you know, they policed their own, so to speak, took care of their own. And also to the point of community centers, this was something that I thought about constantly. And I believe I read that de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, he basically just gave the okay to reinstitute community centers in 5 of the New York City housing projects. And so it makes me really happy, because when I was growing up, yeah, the community center, you know, that was the place. It was directly across from the library. Community center is the place where we gathered. I remember, you know, those mentors, Mr. C and Ms. Davis, and it was a home for us. It was a home for the kids in the community, and they loved us dearly. We loved them. Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, and I visited the neighborhood probably about 2 years ago. I went to a party for one of my, you know, dearest friends, her mom. I remember Mrs. Noble. And, you know, it just, I wanted to cry. You know, I went into the same area where the community center was and the, you know, the library, and both those areas were closed down. And so, but what I saw were people that I had grew up with, and just to see the devastation in those communities, like people that I grew up with and their children, and just looking at, you know, just seeing the devastation or the impact that it had on them, and not being able to have those resources, those community centers. So it makes me really happy that at the very least, you know, that's a step towards reinvesting in the community, and giving the community ownership of, and working with the police, you know, giving them ownership of their very own communities. And a lot of times, just looking at some of the research, like community policing, I was in the New York City Police Department back a lot of years ago, but I remember I was there at the time when it was the then Police Commissioner Lee Brown. I believe it was under the Mayor Dinkins and Lee Brown. He came in, and we had a director of training, Dr. Elsie Scott, and they brought this whole community policing to the New York City Police Department for the very first time. And so I think that if you look at the concept, the you know, of community policing, if you roll it out, or you keep it to its true intent, part of the community policing concept, it's really bringing in the community, but not just having barbecues and, you know, little, you know, giveaways. It was really about giving the community, the intent was to give community ownership, and including, you know, governance. And so you see many communities, I think that community policing gets a bad rap because of the fact that you know, the way that they were implemented. There was a time when grants were given away for community policing, but there was no real follow-up to see how it was implemented, and certainly not an evaluation to see if you know, it was effective, if the intended results were achieved. And so I think that in that respect, you know, going back to community policing, go back to this whole, you know, the true ideology of policing, and it's really up to the leadership to be on board as well. Because I remember when it's rolled out, it's like, okay, those are the 5 police officers that are assigned to community policing. It's soft. We don't want to do that thing. You know, let's put, you know, that's like a desk job. It wasn't considered to be real policing. And so, but you have to engage in like all of the components of it. And so if you, you know, I think that, you know, we just have to develop a lot of different ways to, you know, have a true partnership, and that includes governance as well, and having a say in holding your police department accountable, right? Making policies and including community members as well.
Definitely, definitely. I think that the seat at the table concept is and agency is really important. And to your point about there being good police officers, I just want to say, because I've been a reporter, I've covered policing for 7 years, so not as much experience as you guys have had with it, but I've talked to a lot of police officers, a lot of detectives, a lot of top brass, and I have found a lot of them really do want don't agree with the harsh tactics and want to see reform and want to improve the relationship with the community. And very quickly, I'll say that one of the most, like a couple of the most striking experiences that I've had as reporters, a few of them were in LA going to meetings in Watts between community members and the police, and including the police chief, who just comes out there on a regular basis and talks directly, dialogues with the community members. And then also at this policing forum that was on police community reconciliation, and it had top brass really from all police departments all over the country, and activists from all over the country, and other people who were involved in the issue too. But it was kind of amazing to me. Everybody was super collaborative and productive, but the conversations were really hard, right? Like the police have their feelings about not being appreciated when they're, you know, they feel like they are putting themselves in danger, and they are in a lot of cases. And but the community, you know, the activists who were there, a lot of times had their own very personal, painful experiences with the police, and just you know, so it is hard work having those conversations. And it was just really striking me because it showed how much both sides want to, you know, not everybody, but people want some type of reconciliation, so that there is this safe policing. And in Watts, for example, people really did want police that were going to keep them safe as they walk to and from school, for example. They had these like safe path things, and there were you know, community members, including ex-gang members, who were very, very active in intervention and really taking a leadership role in that regard. So there was a lot of like hand-in-hand work as well. And I think that we should hold ourselves accountable, Andrew and me as media, because, you know, we don't delve into those stories as much, but it's important. And I guess I do admit that the public gets a skewed view sometimes of what's going on, where when you go to some places on the ground, you see like, you know, a lot of people trying to work together on, you know, common goals. So I have a couple follow-up questions. I want to get more specific after Andrew speaks into the issues of the continuum, use of force continuum, and then the police community, you know, or the community policing. I have some questions on that as well. So. But first, we'll go to, we'll now turn to our third speaker, Andrew, and he is going to talk to us. You know, he, like I said, he has this incredible bird's eye view, especially over, you know, 3 decades where we've seen such enormous transformation in policing and in public sentiment. And he's going to talk about the shift in media coverage and public sentiment on reform issues, and then also get into the particulars and some of these topics like qualified immunity that I think are coming up a lot more lately, and police unions too. So I'll turn it over to him and put myself on mute.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it, and thanks to my colleagues on the panel, and thanks to Rhoda for hosting this event, and Stephen for producing it. Yeah, I mean, we're at this moment, right, where there is this broad bipartisan support for police reform, I think meaningful police reform, for a couple of pretty discrete reasons. And I think the biggest reason is technology. We complain about it, and obviously police surveillance and the police technology violates privacy rights all the time, and there are legitimate concerns about the way police use technology. But the way civilians use technology has largely helped begin to hold police accountable for misconduct. You take the case of George Floyd. Without that cell phone video that showed the death of George Floyd in real time or shortly after real time, it is highly likely that none of what has followed would have followed, at least in the way it followed, because the police body camera video might not have been released. There would have been delays. There would have been litigation over it. The police would already had described the death of George Floyd in a way that was not consistent with what we now know to be the truth. You look at what happened to Laquan McDonald in Chicago, where police officials there hid video that was so devastating of his death. So the fact that police are held accountable now by civilians who happen to be witnesses to episodes and incidents of police conduct, police misconduct, police use of force, police use of excessive force is a huge factor here, because these videos go viral. They become national stories immediately, not just local stories. And they help create a narrative. And I think it goes back to before Trayvon Martin. It goes back to before Sandra Bland, who died in a Texas jail, not quite policing, but a related phenomenon. And so you have now this this national memory, this institutional memory that white people have, that policymakers have, that people who probably didn't care about police reform 10 years ago, probably didn't know anything about police brutality 10 years ago, now suddenly are concerned about it. Because when they see something happening in June or May or July of 2020, they say, geez, I remember the episode from 2018 and 2017 and 2016. Eric Garner in New York, for example, the line that you can draw from all of these episodes of police brutality. And I think that has clearly taken root in the national psyche. I think it's clearly a factor in the support that there is now for police reform. The other thing that we have seen over the past couple of years is police officials, police officers proving the point that protesters are trying to make, right? One of the fascinating dynamics of this police protest movement this spring and now into the summer is you have episodes live on TV of police brutality in protests of police brutality. So people are watching in their homes and they're not going out on the streets. Everyone's home because nobody can go out because of the pandemic. And so, you're maybe skeptical about whether there's police brutality in a particular episode or incident or city. You're thinking, well, if there's police getting a little heavy-handed, it's probably because the suspect deserved it or whatever. And then you see what happened in Buffalo, where the police basically, take down this elderly man. Or you see what happened in Lafayette Square Park in Washington with peaceful protesters. You see what's happening this week in Portland, Oregon, where federal police are attacking moms. I mean, moms, right? Who have come out and who clearly aren't, anti-fascists. They clearly aren't the ones throwing, pigs' heads or whatever at the police. It's sort of generating itself. The police are proving the point that they're trying not to prove. And I think that's having a huge impact too. Cell phones, the videos, the coverage of it, the narrative of it, the realization, I think also, that forever, America has failed utterly, government, state, local, federal, has failed utterly to keep track of the extent to which people are killed by police and the instances where these deaths occur and where police use of force is happening. There are just bad data points to it. That's starting to change. The Washington Post, of course, has done work on it. The Guardian has done work on it. Other organizations have done work on it in the context of police violence, police deaths, police shootings, and also in prisons as well. And the idea behind that is to be able to give people a data point, to be able to say, you know, in 2020, there were X amount of police shootings of white people, of black people, whatever, versus 2010. Is it going up? Is it going down? How are these efforts at police reform unfolding, and why are they not working? The fact that for decades, for generations, forever, there has been a lack of that data is not a coincidence. It's not an oversight. It is, I think, a purposeful, intentional tactic on the part of law enforcement agencies to shield what they're doing, right? If the local sheriff doesn't report to the state the amount of police shootings or the amount of excessive force cases or allegations, then, you know, there's a lack of transparency. It generates a lack of accountability. So that, I think, is a factor there. And I think all of it coalesces on the internet, which is in many ways awful and in many ways wonderful. And one of the ways in which it's wonderful is that it allows for, you know, this dissemination of information. It's amazing to me how much interest and knowledge there is, growing knowledge about topics like qualified immunity, right? Which is this very complicated legal doctrine that police and other government officials have been using forever to shield themselves from civil liability when they commit egregious misconduct, deadly misconduct in some cases. Over and over and over again, when police engage in excessive force, when somebody is killed who shouldn't have been killed, police are able to hide behind this doctrine, which until a couple of years ago, I don't think anyone had any idea about if that person wasn't a lawyer or a law student or a professor or a prosecutor. Now people all over are talking about the need to reform qualified immunity. Part of that is this awareness, hey, isn't there a law that prevents these kinds of episodes of excessive force? And if there is a law, why isn't it being enforced? And if there isn't a law, why isn't there a law? Well, it's because the Supreme Court hasn't, has recognized broad protection. There were reasons for that 50 years ago. Maybe those reasons are less valid today. That discussion is happening, I think, in part because of the internet. I think it's happening in part also because there is this, I think, really impressive and sustained push for police reform among conservatives. So you're not just having a conversation among progressives about how to change the police. You're having this very earnest, I think, conversation from the right saying, you know what, this is excessive government intrusion on personal lives, on private lives, and we're going to get involved here. There have been some significant reforms in criminal justice, including police reforms in places like Texas and in Georgia and in other states that you wouldn't really link to those kinds of efforts. So that's been new. And finally, and I want to be brief because I want to allow for a lot of questions. The two doctors who preceded me, especially Dr. Garcia, you talk about police, and there are so many good cops, and there is so much earnest policing that happens on the official level, from the line officers on up. So many people are trying to do so good, and I guess I believe the polls that say that police officers recognize the serious problems they have with racist policing and so forth and so on. And yet you have these police unions. And I think one of the other major developments over the past couple of years, in part because of technology, in part because of the internet, is the dissemination of the racist, outlandish, provocative, often horrible things that police unions say and do in the aftermath of some of these episodes. Maybe 5 years ago, there would be a local story, there would be a local response from the police union, it might shock some people locally, and then the story would die. Now, when you see these local police unions who make these statements in the wake of these episodes, where they attack Black Lives Matter, or they attack the victims in these cases, or it's just straight up, horrific, insulting stuff, that exposes police unions, right? And so people now are asking, wait a minute, what is the role of the police union? Why is the role of the police union different, say, from the teachers union or from the air traffic controllers union? You know, why is there so much contention between police unions and the push for police reform? Why does it seem that police unions seem to be such big obstacles to police reform? We're seeing it on a local level, you see it on a state level, you see it in New York, you see it in blue states, you see it in red states, you see it on the federal level for sure, especially during the Trump administration. So the exposure of the police unions here as a barrier to reform, I think, is a huge issue. I think it's a big open question going forward. And Sarah, you made this point in your introduction. You know, why, if there's so much popular support for basic police reforms, like holding bad cops accountable, right? Or, making sure that there's better training or accountability or transparency. The reason for that is that police unions are enormously powerful politically, or at least they have been. And so they're able to wield enormous power at state legislative levels over politicians. They wield that sort of fear card. We've seen it in New York in the past 6 months with bail reform. We're going to see it again in other places. Unless and until the police union loses some of its political power in these state houses and in Congress, to be honest, I don't think that the reforms that public supports are going to take place. And to me, that's the open question going forward for this election. That's the open question going forward in some of these local DA races between now and this November. And I think that's an open question still not resolved, even as this national coalescence around the need for police reform, even as people in rural America and in suburban America are going to Black Lives Matter protests, or at least being sympathetic to the cause of police reform. The proof is going to be in the pudding, right? When these measures go to state legislatures and the police union says, geez, if you pass this, people are going to die. If you pass this, cops are going to be killed. That, to me, is still the open question, and maybe we can talk about it later. Certainly, we'll know a little bit more than we do now, in the middle of November after the election. So that's my prepared remarks, and we can I guess go to questions, because I imagine there'll be a lot of them.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And just a quick follow up on that too, because I think that the issue of police unions is very interesting. Have you been following the 50A case? 50A is the law that prohibited the release of police misconduct records for the NYPD. And if you want to give us more detail, I'm sure that you...
a federal judge today, right, or yesterday, basically blocked the release of police disciplinary records. New York legislators are saying enough is enough. A police union, let me just back up. Police unions wield enormous power. They've developed these contracts which give police officers who engage in misconduct layer after layer after layer after layer of due process, to the point where it's almost unrecognizable to the rest of us. They are insulated in many, many ways. So legislatures are trying to unwind or undo some of that protection. And in New York, they did. They said, okay, no longer are bad cops going to be able to shield from public view the details of their misconduct. Their disciplinary records at some point have to be released in some fashion, so that people can evaluate, which cops are good, which cops are bad, which officials are covering up for bad cops and not. So that legislative effort was successful, and now you're seeing this backlash from police unions who are furious about the release of disciplinary records. They're making employment law claims, and they're making privacy claims, and so on and so forth. I think that litigation is going to continue, obviously, in New York, but I think it's going to unfold in other jurisdictions around the country, because I think the issue is not unique. These police union contracts are really solid and strong in a lot of places, and I think the fight over them, and it's going to be a fight that has to do with firing police officers now. It's going to be a fight over, transparency, maybe even changing use of force standards. All of that stuff's going to come to head in litigation over these contracts, and we're seeing it unfold in New York this week.
Right. Well, and I think that what's so incredible about the 50A issue too is that that's something that people have been demanding for a long time, and then finally the legislature and the mayor capitulates because of this enormous demand and the protests that we've seen here. And so that's really like the will of the people, the will of the public, right? I mean, overwhelming. I don't think most people think that these records should be private or concealed from the public. And so they were just like blocked, right? The judge just put a restraining order, is that right, on the release?
Yeah, some of the documents I think were already transferred, and the judge just yesterday, right, last night,
Right.
around this time, issued I would guess would be a preliminary injunction to sort of prevent the release of that. But it was the police union lawyers who ran to court and said, this is going to be a catastrophe if that happens. That's the kind of stuff that public sentiment opposes. Those kinds of positions by police unions are basic things. Hey, just like you'd want to know if your teachers engage in misconduct or your doctors engage in misconduct, you want to know if the cop who's testifying against your cousin or your brother or yourself has a history of lying under oath. That's a pretty material thing. And yet that has been kept, quiet. The other thing I'll just add on that point, and this is a whole other level, is you're also seeing, and I think a part of this movement is a little bit of distance now between prosecutors and police, right? Which two agencies, two organizations, if you will, two sides of the criminal justice system that forever have worked together hand in hand to protect one another from misconduct and from responsibility and accountability. You're seeing some distance now. You're seeing some a separation there, especially in jurisdictions that have voted into office reform-minded prosecutors who are like, you know what, we can't serve our constituents and do justice if we are basically protecting bad cops. We're going to try to do more. And boy, when that happens, it's happened in Philadelphia, it's happened in New York, it's happened in other places, the response from the police, the brothers in arms, has been really, really harsh. That conflict also, I think, is an open question about who wins in the end.
Right, right. Well, and actually, Evelyn, you have, since you were in the NYPD and an officer, and you did, as a commander of the police academy, can you speak at all to this role that the police unions have, and the power that they have in determining what reforms get implemented?
Well, I'll just say that I was not the commanding officer of the police academy. I was the education support section. And so in terms of, answering your question, the strength of the police unions, working in the police academy, I wasn't really, aware of like the finer details. I knew that we had representatives in each of the different commands. And what I do know about the power of police unions was that last year I took my students, well, actually some of my grad students, they were, their final research project was on police accountability. And I took a group of them to the actual hearings in New York at that time they were, I think New York was in the process of rewriting the city charter. So at this point in time, these meetings or these hearings were revolved around like civilian complaint review boards, like they wanted to refashion the civilian complaint review board. And so we went to these hearings. There were, throughout the city, they had focus groups, and ultimately they, the legal, they drafted a bill that went before the people to vote on in the city of New York. And so one of the interesting things was that, at these hearings, they did have discussions about, the role of the police and how do we hold them accountable. And so it was pretty interesting that, they talked about it, but I didn't see any of that like in the actual legislation that they were going to vote on. And so, to your point, I know that, my experience is that from what I see reading, because I've been retired from the police department for about 20 years now. And so but I do still stay on top of, you know, the news. And, you know, whenever there's some challenges, you see Patty Lynch, they're out there, and they're going toe to toe, and they represent the union. One of the things that I was thinking about as Andrew, as he was talking, when he talked about, you know, the policing and the unions, and, you know, them being, you know, you have a liberal police department, and yet you have conservative, you know, ideologies that are coming out of the police union. What I think that you know, well, I'm just going to give in the case of New York City, is that the police unions, and I'm not really sure, you know, how they get into office. I would believe that they're elected. And so they've been there for a really long time. And just taking a look at the makeup, the composition of the police department, you do have a lot more diversity. And so in turn, you have more, you know, African-American police officers, you have more Latino, the numbers have increased. When I, you know, 30 years ago, when I was in the police department, you know, it was predominantly male white. And now when you take a look at the police force, you see much more diversity in terms of women and race. And so, you know, I'm just wondering, is it a matter of, you know, changing? And I don't want to, you know, I mean, maybe it's a matter of the union leaders not being reflective of the police force that they represent, right? And that's what I'm just, you know, thinking about. You know, in terms of like what accounts for this disconnect. Like if you have police officers that are saying, you know, we side with you, and we can think of ways to support Black Lives Matters, and yet you have the union speaking differently, you know, it's, I'm not going to say that the leadership has to change, but I'm just saying perhaps, just give a, you know, just taking an educated guess, maybe, you know, the unions aren't reflective of the police departments that they serve.
Exactly what I was thinking.
I mean, really.
Yeah, let me just jump in real quick to say, I wrote a story a couple months ago about 2 episodes in New York, I think in Chicago, right, where police officers expressed sympathy for protesters, peaceful protesters, and then had to do this very public mea culpas, right, where they apologized and, you know, said, oh my gosh, I didn't mean to ruin my career by expressing sympathy by taking a knee. I mean, that's an example of the barrier to reform that you have within these institutions. I think that's clear as it gets.
Right.
Yeah, and that's why when I spoke earlier, I said sometimes you have to work from the inside out, and you do have, you know, officers that express a totally different sentiment, and yet their voices aren't being heard. And so, yeah, those are some of the other barriers that to reform.
Right. Unless you had anything to add, Jason, I wanted to get more into the force issue. We have some questions about it. Did you have anything you wanted to add on unions?
You know, I would just say that, you know, I think it's a product of a certain part of society having allowed this institution to feel above reproach, right? And so we're dealing with the product of that, unfortunately, right? I mean, think about it. This is a part of our government that is supposed to be, you know, we're supposed to be able to critique them. You know, if we're able to critique a politician, our mayor, our city council, anybody else in government, we're supposed to also be able to critique police officers. Like, who do you think you are that you can be a public servant and can't be critiqued and can't be told what to do, right? I mean, if my taxpayer dollars is what's footing your salary, I better be able to tell you what to do. At least I thought that's what our constitutional government was all about, right?
Oh, sorry.
No, I was gonna say, but when you think about the segments of society who are most likely to be affected, right, by the negative activity of this institution, well, they look like me, right, historically and contemporarily. And so if I'm an officer, if I'm in that union, if I'm the union representative, it's like, well, I mean, now you're telling me I can't do this? I'm above reproach. How dare you, right? And this is a power, this is a mindset, this is an ideology that America has allowed this institution to to live and to build over time and space. And I think that's very important for us to understand, right? And again, this is a government institution that is telling us that you can't critique us, you can't tell us what to do.
Right. Yeah. There's in terms of getting upset over the protest, for example, I was just thinking about this the other day. It is the one government institution on the local level where the officers have the ability to take away your freedom. They can make arrests, and they also have they carry guns. So politicians expect protests sometimes. I mean, you should, and that's just part of America. And so this institution in particular, any institution really that serves the public, like there does have to be some openness and particularly with the amount of power that they hold. I have this question that I want to ask because the lack of accountability is super important. And I have always remembered hearing the research that says that the certainty of punishment is the strongest deterrent to crime, rather than the severity of the punishment. But the certainty of the punishment is greater deterrent to crime than severity. And this is like official BLS, issued research. And it's always talked about in the context of crime, of policing crimes. But I'm like, why is this never talked about in the context of police? Because basically there's a certainty that there, in a lot of departments, that there won't be any punishment. So I'm just curious if anybody has looked at any research that has shown if once they're at departments that reforms have been implemented that kind of create the certainty or near certainty of some type of repercussion for use of force, if that changes anything. And on the flip side, a lot of people say, well, it's going to make police officers hesitate in dangerous situations. But any specific research on penalties and how actual frequency of penalty and how that affects brutality. Sorry, Evelyn, did you have you looked at research?
No, I'm just saying, not that I'm aware. I'm just thinking about it. My mind goes. I'm just thinking about some of the challenges or the swiftness of punishment. And again, it's always or the certainty of. And I say theoretically that sounds really fine, and I understand that what you're talking about. If people, if they engage in deviant behavior or break a law, if they're or in any kind of behavior, if there is the way that you social control, or according to social control theory, the way that you are able to, control behavior is one of the theories is that you would, a particular behavior, you would have a punishment, and that punishment would have to be swift and certain. So it's sort of like saying, if a kid knows that if he breaks curfew, there is not going to be a punishment, then guess what? They're just going to continue with the behavior, right? And so putting it into the context of policing, I'm just thinking, they do have I'm going to use the frame of reference to New York City Police Department. Maybe a lot of people don't know, there's a lot of policing of the police that goes on as well. And so for if you engage in certain kinds of behaviors, then there is a penalty that exists. Does it keep people from committing infractions?
Well, I want
to it's
well, the issue with the New York Police Department though is that a lot of times, almost more often than not, for sure, when the CCRB recommends punishment, it doesn't actually get implemented. Right, like there isn't. My impression, correct me if I'm wrong, at least current, my time covering the NYPD, that the issue is that the punishment doesn't happen that frequently, and there's all these means of tracking, looking at misconduct lawsuits that illustrate patterns of behavior, looking at wrongful testimony, test-a-line, I believe it's called. There's IAB. There's a lot of different mechanisms. Even looking at how frequently cases are dismissed, summonses dismissed. I mean, there's just so many ways, and it doesn't ever seem to come back, to the officer.
Yeah. And then another thing too is if you look at, I'm thinking of like some of the DOJ reports that I've read, right, over the course of the years or whatnot, including Newark's, which was the recent one. The most recent, North New Jersey was the most recent DOJ report that I read. But I'm thinking of culture, right? So it really doesn't matter the mechanisms that you put in place. In some case, according to some of the research, it might even be symbolic in many cases, because if the culture doesn't change, it's like, okay, I'll get this right up or what have you, but I go back into the same culture that encourages the same thing anyway. And then if it doesn't go anywhere and falls on deaf ears, what does it really matter at the end of the day?
Right. Well, I think like, we're going to get to the issue of defund and abolition in a moment. We have some questions about it too. But I think that there's a lot of people that are like, well, what if we just, maybe this is why there's so much broad support, but what if we just always held police accountable? Then would we be where we are today? If there was just really strict accountability, the same that we would have with doctors that kill their patients,
Yeah,
I don't think it's all. I think the question is some accountability, right? If you held some more police accountable, you would have less brutality.
Right.
Sarah, I'm wondering, I'm jumping in here because I realize that there are questions from the audience, and before we lose more people because of the time, I wonder if you could take a look at some of the questions and see what has not been addressed tonight that you want to pick out for our speakers to answer. And then we want to definitely leave with some positive ideas for what we can do to advocate for change.
Sure. So the one that I had written down, but it does to talk about next was the had more to do with the use of force continuum. So maybe we'll move on from that for now. So we have some questions about defunding. I think it's something that people don't always necessarily totally understand, but one question, historically, reform has never worked. What are the panelists' opinion on defunding the police, which is actually a basic tenet of the Black Lives Matter movement? And then following up, it's actually the same person. If there is so much more increased diversity on police forces, why do the problems still continue? Why is there so much support of the notion of reform rather than abolition?
So I can speak to the first part. I didn't get the second part of the question, if you can.
Oh, well, why the forces have increased in diversity, a lot of forces, but why do the problems still continue despite increased diversity?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Why is there so much support for reform rather than abolition? Yeah,
because the diversity doesn't really work if the culture is still the same anyway, right? So, I mean, as I often say, there were Black overseers on plantations as well, right? And slavery was our first form of policing in America. I think we have to first understand what policing is and how expansive of a concept and a practice it actually is. But anywho, going back to the abolition standpoint here, I think it goes back to being truly democratic and inclusive, and like I mentioned, allowing certain communities to have voice in how they are to be governed. Right, so the civilian review boards, for instance, right? If you have communities exclaiming that they're being brutalized and harmed by police, and again, theoretically, what we know, right, looking at police textbooks, our Constitution, even and such, we know that like police officers are not supposed to behave this way. They're supposed to be protected and serving. But if you have American citizens, right, because these urban communities are American citizens. So if you have American citizens saying that they're being mistreated and they want this to stop, I think we need to foreground their voices, right? We need to listen to their voices and allow their voices to become part of that democratic experiment, right? And maybe change how these areas are being policed. And perhaps policing is going to look different in some of these areas. We may have to disband how, policing as we know it in certain areas and give it back into the hands of the community. There are restorative justice models that exist and that have shown to work. The problem here is that they don't get the money. They don't get the funding that they deserve. And then we try, and then in other instances, we sort of problematize them and try to devalue them by using terms such as evidence-based, right? Oh, well, it's not evidence-based, so we can't, which is a fancy and sort of cute way of, like I mentioned, devaluing them and saying that it's not going to work and it's some type of utopian idea, But I come from the perspective that if this is what the community wants to do, then we should allow this community to do it.
Right. Well, and of course, a lot of the programs that were implemented nationwide weren't evidence-based. Didn't have really the data to back them. It kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about housing projects being used as petri dishes or labs to experiment. But then when, Black people really are saying something that they want, then people are like, oh no, it's not evidence-based.
It's not evidence, because that's going to be the new terminology that you got to watch out for, because whenever Black people or marginalized people want something, first we have to review the evidence. If it's not evidence-based, and when you ask people to really define what that means, they can't even do it, right? It's a socially, politically constructed term that, that they use in arguments to devalue something that could be more innovatively suitable for these communities. And it's unfortunate. And I should add again, parenthetically, that there are initiatives that have shown to work, right? And so they already exist. There
was a recent research, semi-recent, from the Brennan Center actually, that found increases in crime, strong correlations with increases in crime based on the number of community organizations in cities, and I think that there are other, outside of this sort of criminal justice policing research, there's a lot of research.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And social work and public health and such. And I'll just say really quickly, you probably can't measure, quote unquote, right, these initiatives the same way in which you might measure, these sort of old school traditional programs, right? So we have to sort of interrogate this notion, this idea of how do you measure success. But
you have to look at what you get out of them. If you get both a drop in crime and an increase in jobs and other things,
that's right,
like opportunities and so forth, then it's sort of more bang for the buck.
That's right. That's right.
Are anyone not really familiar with Camden? We have a question about Camden as an example of this kind of reimagining policing. Anyone want to take that on?
Mm-hmm. So what was the question?
Well, just because Camden has come up lately because they kind of reimagined how public safety was done,
the Marshall Project has done some work on Camden, and there have been some really good stories lately as well. Like everything else, it's a complicated story. I think it's been framed in some outlets as this great success story, right? That Camden basically shut everything down and started from scratch and built it up. And there are a lot of facts, a lot of data that suggests that some of it has worked, but not all of it has worked. And there are a lot of complaints from folks who are being over-policed still.
That's right.
In Camden as a result of the reforms. So it's you'd like to look for some sort of, model for a big city that's going to work in that sense. The defunding, the sort of reimagining of police forces. I'm not sure, and I'm glad to see the doctors agreeing with me. I'm not sure that's the success story that a lot of people thought it would be or hoped it would be.
Yeah, because they sort of toughened up. I'm thinking of, it wasn't a federalization of policing, right? But there was a sort of county takeover of the police. And so it was this sort of get tough approach. And whenever you have that going on, sort of like what Donald Trump is doing right now, right? Federalizing local policing with sending, federal agents into. So whenever you have that sort of thing going on, that's never a good thing. Never a good thing. Because you're taking local control away from we the people. And so that's never a good thing. But I can tell you with the Camden situation, yes, it for many people on the ground, it resulted in hyper surveillance, okay? And again, if we don't have to have this in suburban.
Oh, can you just be specific?
Hyper surveillance, meaning that the strategy consisted in having more police officers also on the block and around town, if you will. So if we don't have to have this in other communities where we also know crime is taking place, and I don't care if it's just, drug crime or violent crime or whatever have you, then we need not have it in Camden either, right? I think little kids and adults and such in Camden, they have a right to walk around freely without occupation, just as someone in a neighboring white suburb.
Did you have anything you wanted to add? Evelyn?
Oh, I was just thinking, can you hear me? Oh, let's see.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay. No, when, you know, at the mention of Camden, I was just thinking about, I believe it was Camden that they fired everyone in the police department and they started from scratch. Either it was Camden or Trenton. I think it was Camden. And so, and part of the reason that that they did so was because there was, no, I believe it was in Trenton.
Is there a good model out there that exists?
Well, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, Sarah, the models continue to focus on quote unquote better policing. So we're not looking at root causes, right? So none of these models focus on bettering the community, right? So as you mentioned, economic upward mobility, right? Again, for these colonized communities that have frankly never been given a chance. I think that needs to be the model. And so when we're talking about abolition or divestment and such, that is what we're talking about. So putting that money into the community to create more healthy communities so that you won't need the police, right? You won't have to worry about crime. So, and in this context too, we understand how crime is manufactured and created, right? Essentially by these mechanisms of poverty and depravity and so forth and so on. So if we do that, we can create healthy communities. Like you said, get a bigger bang for your buck. So
yeah, exactly. Well, and also I think that a lot of the sort of paradigm that we're looking at is like on the opposite end of the coin, the way that white communities are policed and are managed as a whole. Did you have something you want to add, Andrew?
Yeah, there's two communities that I think people could look to. They're both in the Pacific Northwest. Eugene, Oregon, really creative program. I think it's called COHEN, which is sort of a novel thing that's working. It seems to be working now. Eugene is not New York or Camden or whatever, but and also Olympia, Washington. We're about to publish a story at the Marshall Project about Olympia, Washington, and the way in which local officials there have figured out that they're going to separate out 911 calls that have to do, for example, with mental illness or drug addiction or homelessness, and they're not going to send cops with guns. They're going to send other people, and they're not going to be in a uniform, right? They're going to be designed to, from the very get-go, de-escalate and reroute. And people seem to be relatively happy. The police are happy, obviously, because they can focus on crimes that are more likely to be violent. They are not going to be put as often into situations where there's going to be escalation, as we see so tragically with mentally ill suspects and folks. And everyone seems to be, it's early yet, but I think those are a couple of models. And I think that's what's going to happen in the short term in many jurisdictions. That's the kind of change that's going to come to policing. It's not going to be defunded. There's not going to be, jurisdictions that have no cops anymore. There's just going to be a reimagining in that sense. And it's going to be, a change sort of, implemented in smaller increments.
Yeah, yeah. And it helps policing, like Evelyn mentioned earlier, because when you think about policing as it's currently constituted, look, think about the suicide rates, right? Think about, how they often have to bring this home and how it leads to alcoholism and dependence on drugs and different things of that sort. This might help policing in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of police that I've spoken to have said that they don't like to answer those calls too, because they feel like what they have to do is inappropriate, and it's risky for them as well. So I hear you on that. I think that a lot of police I've talked to too don't really like the quotas and the broken windows. So there's definitely some support from within for that too. So kind of switching topics, and I just want to say, like, by 9:20, I think we should talk some more about kind of solutions that people can get behind and even participate in for people that do want to help with the change. I thought that this question was interesting. Do you have any explanation as to why the George Floyd video truly disturbed so many Americans, when there have been more than enough videos of both racism against Black people by either the police or white people, and police brutality? I think that that's really interesting. I have a theory, but why don't you start?
Well, I think it's definitely compounded by, right, the COVID-19 situation as well. You know, everyone sort of happened to sit and bear witness to it, right? But for a grown man to be recalling out for his mom who's deceased, right? I think that just hit everyone sort of differently a little bit, right? And again, just to have to watch this man die on tape, right? To watch him die on tape and to look at the essence of that officer's face, you know? And as well as the essence of his partners sort of standing by and watching this happen and not do a thing, I think this particular incident, I think just hits your soul differently.
Yeah. Did you want to add something, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I just think the lack of ambiguity surrounding it, right? I mean, I thought of the shooting in South Carolina, right? The video of the cop shooting the man in the back, as Walter Scott was the victim in that case, running away, you know? And it was clear that there was a shooting, and he posed no danger to that officer, who I think since was prosecuted. But even in that situation, there was some ambiguity about their initial.
Sorry, can you just cut out this for me?
Yeah, me too.
You know,
Okay.
On the ground, it's an excruciating long period of time. Oh, am I breaking up? Can you hear me?
We got you
I
back.
can-
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Sorry. It's it's an excruciatingly long period of time. It's all captured on tape. There's obvious no threat that he poses to anyone at that time. The other officers are basically saying, "Hey, let up, let up." I mean, I think Dr. Williams is right. I think it's a cumulative effect. The other thing that should be noted, and that I think has been underreported, is Minneapolis had a bad history of that kind of stuff. There was a bad history of racist policing and excessive force in Minneapolis that had not been addressed in previous years. I think that generated the local uproar that I think fueled the national interest.
Do you think that there was any impact from, it's been noted that these protests have seen a lot more participation from white people, and in some communities, smaller communities, that the movements were almost entirely white, but the amount of violence that we were seeing, the videos against white protesters, it's pretty much almost seem equal, to the black protesters. And I just wonder if, going back to that kind of gaslighting thing that I said before, like that, do you think that made people see that it's real? Like, oh, wow. Like,
yeah, and I also think demographics have played a role in the fact that you see Black Lives Matter protests in rural places and in suburban places, which are, seeing more, Black people and Hispanic people living in communities. And I think that to me is the surprising thing here, is that so many of these protests took place in small towns and in red states and in places that you would not have picked. And I think that's got to be fueling, right, the public support for these reforms. But I think it's a good point that you make, Sarah, that the face of the protesters, right, white people could resonate with the face of the protesters when the protesters.
Or maybe it was even easier for them to sympathize that these people weren't doing anything wrong. I don't know.
Yeah. I think a lot of the sort of the response on behalf of police, right, at many of the locations of protest. So you mentioned, I think Andrew mentioned in DC, right, at Lafayette Park, the elderly gentleman in Buffalo, for instance, right? That has a way, I think, in a very peculiar way of sort of humanizing the issue for many white folk who may be at home watching. But not only those instances, but also on the front lines, right? So for many of us who were watching CNN, Fox, MSN, whatever your source may have been, right? Watching the people on the front lines being tear gassed and such. And again, just the sort of compounding effects of COVID-19, the compounding effects of people losing jobs, being laid off, waiting on the lines for unemployment to answer their calls. All of this, I think, has a compounding effect on the state's utter failure to really care and protect us. And of course, in the backdrop of 45, all of this, I think, has a compounding effect. And it completely humanizes, I think, this whole entire issue of policing.
Yes, I think that there's just a sense that the kind of Constitution is hinging on, you know, like these protesters are kind of like on the front lines of defending our country in a way.
That's right. Yeah, and yeah, there you go. Yeah, all of it became wrapped up. All of it became wrapped into.
Which is well, I don't want to get too much on a tangent, but because that could very easily happen. Rapid fire. I just want, because there have been like a couple kind of very specific questions. What is the program in Washington, Andrew, that you had mentioned? Someone I think just wanted it for reference.
I don't know what the program's called, but we're publishing a piece like in the next 12 hours at Marshall. So
okay.
At Marshall Project. I wrote the headline for it, but I forgot. So I don't know what it is, but something crisis responders in Washington. But that's where you can find it.
Okay, and then EVELYN, how do you get the statistics on police suicides that you had referenced a couple times?
Oh no, with police suicides, I was just referencing actually the number of police suicides that had occurred in New York probably about 2 years ago. And so, but I mean, I'm sure that if you go to BJS, you probably could find some data there, right? If they're documenting them. But again,
yeah, and I think I've been hearing about. I'm sorry, what?
No, I'm saying a lot of times with this data collection, we don't have, you know, this like a central repository, and what you have to do is just go and take a look at newspaper articles to piece this together to get an idea. But I'm sure that somebody has researched this. I mean, it's something that's timely, something that's really important. But a good place to start would be the Bureau of Justice Statistics. They do keep a lot of that type of data.
I know the Badge of Life is a nonprofit organization that came about to kind of respond to it. I'm not sure if they probably hold data, but there is no official source that I know of that actually, believe it or not, collects such data. But the Badge of Life is a nonprofit organization I know that was founded to respond to police suicides. That might be a source for someone to look at.
Right. There's also a specific question about the various rates of police killings. I don't necessarily want to get into all the specifics, but I think that the Washington Post series, or perhaps the Guardian series, would be the best source, correct me if I'm wrong, for the statistics on rates and whether they were armed or not. Do you know of any others that you would recommend people to reference if they want to have all the numbers right in front of them?
Well, actually, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was quoting that particular data and in one of the book chapters that I had written on police use of force. And at that time, this was probably about when I wrote it initially, using data from 2014. And at that time, there was this whole notion of not having central repositories to collect these data. So in getting this data, it was basically looking at these nonprofit organizations that publish this type of data. There was no national source. And actually it was a call for, with many other individuals that study policing, a call for a national repository. And I believe that to collect this data, and I, as a result of the 21st Century Policing Initiative, that was a meeting of chiefs of police, and during the President Obama administration, one of the recommendations were to create this central repository, but that didn't happen.
Great. Thank you for that. So I just wanted to make sure that we leave time to talk about some constructive or tangible solutions that people can get behind. And also if there's things that people can involve themselves with. I feel like, EVELYN, you had touched on this point that, you know, a lot of people who are looking at this are not thinking that it's a problem with their department too, but it might be. So if you want to just each go around, maybe we'll start. I'm just looking at the order you guys are on my screen. So we'll start with Andrew, then EVELYN, then Jason. Yeah.
I'll just
And keeping in mind that we only have 8 minutes, so don't take more than 2.
I'll be really quick. All of this stuff, so much of it has come about because of reporting, because of journalism, because of advocacy groups, because of folks of various stripes who are fighting for transparency and accountability on policing. And it's coming at a time when local news is basically being destroyed by economic forces, by the pandemic and so forth. So if you're looking to do something constructive, support local news, support local advocacy organizations, you know, hold your local paper accountable, fight for your local television station, support nonprofits. I know I'm biased because I'm part of nonprofits, but even when I wasn't, support nonprofits. And because the only way this is going to change is if information and facts and evidence comes out there and continues to change public opinion to the point where the politicians follow, the policy follows, the judges follow. So that would be my brief pitch.
Evelyn?
I'm thinking along the same lines of Andy's comment. You have to get involved. You have to educate people. You have to, you know, just take a look at your local community, because I think that when you think about what's happening, a lot of times people have the impression that they can't have a direct impact. But if you start with your own local community and engage in the work, and again, use the resources that are available at the local level, you have a much better, you know, you'll have, you know, some sort of impact. And also, again, engage with the nonprofits. There are a lot of nonprofits that are out there. Support them. They are taking on new initiatives. Reimagining Justice, I'm just going to put a plug in there. It's a nonprofit that's based in New York. A good friend of mine, a colleague, Dr. Lisa Chowdhury, she does a lot of work in the city of Paterson, and she works in community organizing and also helps, like there are a lot of people that are in that community that are trying to do the work, and she organizes it so that it can provide wraparound services. And so if you're not really sure what you can do, you know, look locally and start from there.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice is a great nonprofit in our region that's been doing excellent work around all of these issues, advocacy issues in a variety of areas, right? Economic justice, criminal justice, you name it, in a variety of areas. I think that's a one-stop shop center, so you can head to their website for data points or whatnot. I'm also thinking about a conversation I had with Sarah a few days ago too, about data, right? Interrogating what data is, this notion of data, you know, going beyond just numbers and understanding life stories as data points. And in particular, when we're thinking about policing, right? So different community experiences with policing, we have to understand how stories must count and how that must become part of the conversation around how we might even evaluate programs, right? Whether or not these programs are working, or whether or not we should fund certain programs and initiatives, because I think this is going to become part 2 of the conversation around divestment, you know, how, or this evidence-based claim that they like to throw into the conversation, if you will. So just thinking more broadly about how we think about evidence, you know, how we think about facts, if you will.
Right. There's so much that can't be captured in data. As a reporter that does both types of reporting, the data doesn't even start to capture some of the like just shocking things that people have told me, and there's just no data set really out there that would capture it. And also keeping in mind that data is being entered by humans. So a lot of the police data that people are looking at is really just the data that the patrol officers are entering in to the database, or maybe the detectives or, you know, CompStat units. So I'm sorry, but, you know, 6 little fields about a incident is not really going to tell you that much. I just use it to look at trends, but it's not really like the crux of what works and what doesn't. I want to add 2 things. One, you know, to, you know, of course, support newspapers. I was at the Daily News for almost 5 years, and I was always just blown away by the amount of influence that paper has. I myself, you know, my stories triggered, you know, almost 24 laws that helped dismantle broken windows policing, but it wasn't just me, it was the platform, and the fact that it did daily coverage, it really makes a difference. There are so many instances of accountability and impact that happen just from day-to-day coverage. It's not just investigations, and so people should support their local paper if they see reporters that are doing stuff that matters. Those reporters are getting laid off. The guy that got the Eric Garner video, Daily News photographer, because he was riding around and thought, oh, this call seems interesting, unusual in Staten Island. He went there, only photographer there. Times is not going to go there. No other, ProPublica is not going to go there. And I love those organizations, but this is Daily News, so that's why he was there and was directed to that video, which changed a lot. And so without those jobs, that kind of stuff doesn't happen. The other thing is I think, and I, as a reporter, I can't tell you what, but letters actually make a big difference for elected officials. And so I know a lot of people are like, we actually had a question on here about what can you do other than protest. And I think a lot of people are rightfully hesitant to protest right now. Yeah. But letters have a really big impact, and you can write your elected officials letters on what you think should happen. And it doesn't take that long, but that makes a big difference. So let's see, we have 2 more minutes. What should we talk about?
And social media, and you can engage on social media, right?
That's true.
If you don't want to go outside, social media, activism, anything you do on there, it's helpful too. It helps in the cause.
Yes.
One quick thing that I just wanted to add about in the state of New Jersey, the state attorney general's office has developed this policing, excellence in policing initiative. And right now what they're doing is they are going to go out into communities, but also they have posted on their website questions about, because they're going to reform the police use of force continuum. So they are requesting the input from the community. So I would recommend that you go to the New Jersey State Attorney General's office and
I'd like to put myself on again.
Yes.
Sure.
I can't.
Yeah. I think you're just on mute right now.
You can hear her.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for a really great night. My gosh, there's so much information here to sort out. And I like the fact that we did end on some positive notes of things people can take away and do. And I appreciate so much all you have, the information you've provided and the good discussion that was created here. And you know what, let's keep in touch, because this is not going away. And I'm going to need your help as we go along, and as NFRPP wants to continue to provide information to its really growing network and keep this in the forefront. So I look forward to staying in touch with you, and we keep this discussion going. It's the first of many to come, I'm sure. So thank you again, Andrew, Evelyn, Jason, and you, Sarah, for pushing this thing along. It was wonderful, and we all appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
You.
Okay.
All right.
Good night.
Bye.